In the history of music, there is a cursed number, 27. It's the age that claimed Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, and Jim Morrison. For decades, it was a haunting legend of a bygone era. But in 1994, that haunting number seemed to reappear with tragic force. In April, Kurt Cobain joined the list. The world mourned the loss of another musical genius at the fatal age. But the curse of 94 wasn't finished. The story everyone forgets is that just weeks later, another musician from Cobain's inner circle also died, also at 27. Her name was Kristen Pfaff, a classically trained musician who became the powerful bassist for Courtney Love's band Hole. Why is her name always left out when we talk about the 27 Club? Was her death just another sad rock and roll cliche? Or does her story reveal something more complicated about the music scene of that era and the pressures she was trying to escape in her final days? To answer that question and to truly understand the world that swallowed her, we have to go back to the cultural explosion of the early 1990s. It was a time of radical change in music and culture. The glossy, synthesized pop and hair metal of the 1980s had suddenly been rendered obsolete by a raw, authentic, and angst-ridden sound emerging from the Pacific Northwest. In 1991, Nirvana's album Nevermind was not just a record, it was a revolution. It shattered the music industry's status quo, unleashing a wave of bands playing what would be dubbed grunge or alternative rock. Seattle became the undisputed epicenter of this new alternative nation. Bands like Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, and Alice in Chains were suddenly global superstars. The aesthetic was one of flannel shirts, torn jeans, and a deep-seated cynicism towards mainstream culture. It felt real, honest, and powerful. But beneath this celebrated authenticity, a dark and dangerous undercurrent was flowing. Heroin, a drug that had been largely confined to jazz clubs and punk squats in previous decades, made a terrifying comeback. It became tragically intertwined with the grunge identity, seen by some as a symbol of ultimate authenticity and creative suffering. It was a deadly epidemic that would claim many of the scene's brightest talents. But Seattle was not the only hub of creative energy. Hundreds of miles to the east, another city had its own powerful and respected music scene, Minneapolis, Minnesota. The Minneapolis sound was often grittier, more abrasive, and more heavily influenced by punk and noise rock than its Seattle counterpart. It was the city that had given the world bands like The Replacements and Husker Du. It was a scene that valued artistic integrity and a strong DIY ethic over commercial success. It was a community, a place where musicians supported each other. And it was in this less hyped but arguably more artistically pure environment that Kristen Pfaff honed her craft and became a respected musician in her own right. Kristen Marie Pfaff was born on May 26, 1967, and grew up in Buffalo, New York. From a young age, it was clear she was exceptionally bright and artistically gifted. She wasn't a rebellious kid who picked up a guitar in a fit of teenage angst. Her musical education was formal and classical. She was trained as a classical pianist, developing a deep understanding of music theory that became the secret weapon behind her powerful and melodic bass playing. She was also an excellent student, graduating from a prestigious private academy and demonstrating a keen intellect and a curiosity about the world. Born Kristen Marie Parco to Janet and her first husband Mike, whose own family boasted a string of accomplished musicians that hinted at the talent running in her blood, she faced early changes when her folks split up. Janet remarried Norman Pfaff, a steady presence who adopted Kristen and gave her his name, along with a sense of family that included her younger brother Jason, who'd go on to chase music himself. That Buffalo upbringing in a working-class corner of town built her resilience, with classical lessons not just in piano but cello too, honing that ear for harmony and structure she'd carry through life. School at the all-girls Catholic Buffalo Academy of the Sacred Heart wrapped up in 1985, where her sharp mind stood out in classes, fueling a worldview that blended intellect with a quiet drive to question and explore. After a brief period studying in Europe, she settled in Minneapolis, Minnesota to attend the University of Minnesota. It was here that she fully immersed herself in the city's thriving underground music scene. In 1992, she co-founded the band Janitor Joe alongside guitarist and vocalist Joachim Breuer and drummer Matt Ensminger. Janitor Joe was not a grunge band. They were a raw, powerful, and abrasive noise rock trio. Their music was loud, chaotic, and uncompromising, and Kristen's bass playing was the anchor of their sound. It was heavy, melodic, and muscular, Brian overdriving the songs with a relentless force. She was not just the girl bassist, she was a co-founder, a songwriter, and a crucial creative force. Janitor Joe quickly gained a reputation as one of the best and most intense live bands in the Twin Cities, releasing an album on the respected indie label Amphetamine Reptile Records, and touring extensively. Kristen was not just a musician. She was a beloved and respected member of a tight-knit artistic community. That European stint right after high school was more of a cultural soak, wandering places like Holland, where she even penned breathless letters home about the challenges of young life abroad before dipping into Boston College for a spell. But Minneapolis pulled her in deep when she transferred to the University of Minnesota, diving into a women's studies major that sharpened her views on equality and power. By 1991, she'd taught herself bass, channeling that classical precision into a self-taught grit, and hooked up with Breuer, fresh from his old band The Bastards, and Ensminger to kick off Janitor Joe. Their sound pulled from everywhere: the heavy rumble of Northwest grunge, the sharp snap of DC post-hardcore, and the twisted vibes of outfits like Big Black or Butthole Surfers on Touch and Go. Kicking things off with the Hamong single in '92, followed by Bullethead on a picture disc that same year. They built steam fast. Come '93, the Boyfriend 7-inch dropped, leading into their debut full-length Big Metal Birds, where her tracks like the brooding Boys in Blue opened up breathing room in the frenzy, contrasting Breuer's tighter, frantic cuts like One Eye. Critics noted how her style mixed punishment with melodic payoff, making the album a standout in the indie noise world. They even tossed in Under the Knife on an OXO Records EP that year, and with Amphetamine Reptile pushing a tour single Stinker, the band hit the road nationally, grinding through shows that cemented their live rep as ferocious, often sharing bills with heavyweights like Helmet. Her life in Minneapolis was about more than just music. She was a passionate social activist, a feminist, and a fierce advocate for women's rights. She volunteered with the University of Minnesota's Restore program, supporting survivors of sexual violence, and was active in local feminist organizing. She was a woman of deep convictions, someone who channeled her intelligence and passion into trying to make the world a better, safer place. By all accounts, she was happy, fulfilled, and deeply rooted in her community. That activism ran core deep, tying into her studies, as she counseled rape survivors through Restore's crisis lines and self-defense workshops, empowering women on campus with practical tools against violence. In 1990, she threw herself into organizing the 24-hour rape-free zone event, a bold spotlight on assaults happening right there at the university and beyond, declaring its aim to draw attention to violence brought against women on campus and in the world. She even spun records as a DJ on Radio K, the college station, blending tracks that echoed her edge, A surviving clip shows her smooth voice introducing tunes with that same thoughtful fire. It was this blend of intellect and action that made her a fixture in Minneapolis's overlapping worlds of art and advocacy, where friends saw her as the one always pushing for real change without fanfare. Then, in 1993, a phone call came that would change the course of her life. On the other end of the line were Courtney Love and Eric Erlandson of the band Hole. Hole was on the verge of exploding. Their debut album had been a critical success, and with Courtney Love's marriage to Kurt Cobain, they were at the very center of the alternative rock universe. They were looking for a new bassist to record their major label debut, and they had heard about the powerhouse player from Minneapolis. They wanted Kristen. It sparked during Janitor Joe's California Swing that spring, where Love and Erlandson eyed her on-stage fury firsthand, scouting to replace Jill Emery after inking that hefty 8-album Geffen deal, reportedly worth $3 million. Riding the wave from Pretty on the Inside's indie acclaim and a solid following in England. She brushed them off initially, loyal to her Minneapolis setup, but they persisted with calls, and her stepdad Norman broke it down plainly. From a professional point of view, there was no decision, highlighting the leap from underground tours to potential arenas. Janet, her mom, fretted over the uprooting, but Kristen mulled the chance to layer her refined touch into a band blending punk's snarl with broader hooks, amplifying themes of rage and resilience that aligned with her own convictions. For Kristen, this was a monumental and agonizing decision. She loved Janitor Joe. She loved her life and her friends in Minneapolis. She was wary of the major label music machine and the chaotic, drug-fueled reputation that already surrounded Hole and the Seattle scene. But the opportunity was immense. This was a chance to take her music to a global audience, to achieve a level of success she could never have reached with her indie band. After much deliberation, and with the reluctant blessing of her Janitor Joe bandmates, who understood this was an opportunity she couldn't refuse, she made the life-altering choice. She packed her things and moved to Seattle to become the new bassist for Hole. Shifting coasts meant jumping into a lineup hungry for evolution, locking in with drummer Patty Schimmel, whose solid beats meshed with Kristen's rhythmic anchor, forming a backbone that toughened Hole's edge. Rehearsals fired up quick, refining raw ideas into something more layered, with her input bridging the band's scrappy past to a sharper, ambitious future. Erlandson nailed it later. That's when we took off. All of a sudden, we became a real band, crediting how she turned them cohesive and potent. Upon arriving in Seattle in 1993, Kristen was immediately thrust into the whirlwind of recording what would become Hole's seminal album, Live Through This. Her musical talent was a perfect fit for the band. Her powerful melodic bass lines provided a muscular and sophisticated foundation for Courtney Love's raw vocals and Eric Erlandson's chaotic guitar work. She also contributed backing vocals, her clearer, more controlled voice providing a beautiful and haunting counterpoint to Love's ragged screams. She was a professional and a stabilizing force in the studio, and her contributions were instrumental to the album's sound. Sessions stretched from early 1993 onward, a grind where cuts like Miss World fell into place late amid marathon hours, her bass injecting brooding pulses into Jennifer's body, or weaving alive lines in Violet that gave the fury a living spine, blending her classical roots for depth that pushed the album to multi-platinum heights. Her vocals added ethereal layers, softening sharp edges to heighten the record's emotional punch on themes of vulnerability and defiance. As the pro in the room, she steadied the chaos, her maturity refining arrangements into intentional powerhouses that defined 90s rock. But the move to Seattle also plunged her into a new and dangerous social environment. The drug culture in the Seattle scene was far more pervasive and destructive than what she had known in Minneapolis. Heroin was everywhere. She began a relationship with guitarist Eric Erlandson, and amid a Seattle scene where heroin was widespread, her substance use escalated. For a person like Kristen, who was known for her intensity and her tendency to throw herself wholeheartedly into things, this new experience would prove to be catastrophic. Dubbed the heroin hub of the era, Seattle wove the drug through its music veins like an unavoidable fog. Love herself called it absurd, with everybody in their orbit hooked. Kristen's lighter experiments back home ramped up in the isolation, linking to risky ties Erlandson had flagged, her all-in-nature turning dabbles into a tightening hold by winter's recording push. Her relationship with Erlandson pulled her deeper into the scene's dangerous lifestyle, and her personal struggles began to mirror the themes of despair in the album she was helping to create. The period between 1993 and 1994 was a blur of incredible creative highs and devastating personal lows. The band finished recording Live Through This, an album that everyone knew was destined for greatness. Then, on April 8, 1994, the world came to a halt. The news broke that Kurt Cobain was dead. For the members of Hole, and for Kristen, who had become a friend of Kurt's, the grief was immediate and overwhelming. Their entire world was plunged into a state of shock and sorrow. Live Through. This was released on April 12, 1994, 1 week after Cobain's death and 4 days after his body was found. The album, with its themes of pain, survival, and female rage, became an instant classic, but its success was forever shrouded in the shadow of Kurt's death. Wrapping the record felt like a triumph, but early '94 brought detox in February at a Minneapolis center like Hazelden, a bid to claw back control amid escalating use and band tensions. Clean and refocused, she looped back to Janitor Joe for a spring tour, reigniting that raw energy before Cobain's suicide shattered everything, prompting her final split from Hole. The album hit shelves amid the mourning, its raw survival anthems amplified by the loss, but for Kristen, it crystallized the need to break free. For Kristen, the tragedy was a wake-up call. She saw firsthand the ultimate devastating consequence of the drug-fueled world she had entered. She made a decision to save her own life. She left Seattle in the toxic environment of the band and checked herself into a detox and rehabilitation facility in her old home of Minneapolis. By all accounts, she got clean, reconnected with old friends, and began making plans for her future. She decided to leave Hole and move back to Minneapolis, planning to rejoin Janitor Joe or start a new project. She was choosing life. She was choosing to go home. Cobain's end hit close, given their budding friendship, shared laughs and insights in that tight circle, exposing the scene's toll and fueling her resolve. Post-rehab, she eyed rejoining Janitor Joe full-time, or sparking something fresh, like a project tentatively called Palm with Minneapolis pals, rooting back in the stability that had grounded her before. In early June of 1994, with her treatment completed and her sobriety on solid ground, she made one final trip back to Seattle. The purpose of the trip was simple: to pack up her apartment and retrieve her belongings, including her beloved bass guitars. It was meant to be a clean break, the final act of closing a dark and painful chapter of her life. She was accompanied by Paul Erickson, a friend from Minneapolis, who had agreed to help her pack and drive back. On the night of June 15th, she spoke with her father, He later told reporters she had always seemed to be in control of her circumstances. The next morning, on June 16, 1994, Kristen Pfaff was found unresponsive in the bathtub of her Seattle apartment. Paul Erickson went to check on her and discovered her unresponsive. Paramedics were called, but it was too late. The medical examiner ruled her death an accidental opiate overdose. She was 27 years old. The escape plan had failed at the final hurdle. Landing in Seattle on the 14th with Erickson, a musician buddy from the band Palm, to load a U-Haul with her stuff, including those treasured instruments, it was all set for a fresh start. Erlandson dropped by that last night of the 15th, her final hours alive. Come morning, Erickson found her amid syringes and gear, the coroner citing acute opiate intoxication. But Janet questioned the ruling, insisting in interviews that Kristen wasn't a hardcore user and pointing to oddities like the locked bathroom door and her packed bags, fueling doubts in a scene rife with shadows. Hole dedicated their 97 compilation My Body, the hand grenade to her, with her bass echoing on tracks there too, preserving a legacy that bridged indie noise to major rock, her activism and artistry leaving marks that still resonate. The portrait of Kristen Pfaff that emerges from the memories of those who knew her is one of a brilliant, passionate, and deeply compassionate human being. Far from a mere victim of drugs, she embodied a multifaceted spirit whose untapped potential continues to resonate with profound loss among her loved ones. Friends from her Minneapolis era, especially her Janitor Joe bandmates, describe her as the stabilizing force in their tight-knit circle. They highlight her infectious laugh, razor-sharp wit, and unwavering loyalty, portraying her as the grounded mom figure who ensured everyone's well-being. In a documentary on her life, one friend recounted with tears how she was the go-to person in crises, calm, resourceful, and empathetic, qualities that sharply contrast the turmoil she later faced in Seattle. Her mother, Janet Pfaff, has shared heartfelt insights over the years, recalling a prodigious child who mastered music and academics effortlessly. Janet emphasized Kristen's profound empathy and commitment to social justice, including her activism roots. Notably, in the weeks before her death, after a successful rehab in Minnesota, Kristen reconnected with these ideals by planning to collaborate with organizations aiding abused women. A letter from that period reveals her revitalized purpose, aiming to channel personal struggles into helping others, evidence of someone reclaiming agency rather than surrendering to despair. Within Hole's turbulent dynamics, her bonds were intricate. With Courtney Love, accounts vary. Some depict a sisterly alliance forged through shared musical fervor and gender challenges in rock, while others note creative clashes between two assertive personalities. Guitarist Eric Erlandson's reflections in his book Letters to Kurt add depth, conveying deep remorse over their mutual addiction spiral. He details their pact to achieve sobriety together, haunted by his survival amid her loss, and underscores the Seattle scene's overwhelming pressures, fame, isolation, and pervasive drugs that neither was ready to navigate. Erlandson remembered her vitality and intellect, traits devoured by the era's shadows. The emotional weight of her final days intensifies the tragedy. After rehab success and future plans, including a return to Minneapolis support, she relapsed in Seattle amid familiar triggers. Accompanied by a friend for moral backing, her overdose occurred just before departure. Discovered the next morning after a hopeful call with her father the night prior. This sequence underscores addiction's fragility, the narrow divide between triumph and tragedy. Kristen Pfaff's death intersects key debates on 1990s alternative rock. Central is the Seattle curse notion, Her Minneapolis allies argue the city's heroin-saturated, fame-fueled environment, unlike their smaller, nurturing community, proved fatally toxic, suggesting her survival hinged on staying put. This ties into scrutiny of Hole's internal chaos, where high-stakes pressures and enabling behaviors amplified risks. Though band members counter they were all victims of shared demons in an unforgiving industry, blurring lines between personal and group accountability. Modern views reframe addiction as a disease shaped by biology, trauma, and context, not moral lapse, highlighting Kristen's rehab resilience as proof of her fortitude and her relapse as a universal vulnerability demanding empathy over judgment. Her passing's ripples endure musically and culturally. On Live Through This, her bass work, robust, melodic, and structurally vital, plus ethereal backing vocals, cement the album's status as a 1990s landmark, preserving her artistry. Occurring shortly after Kurt Cobain's suicide, it amplified awareness of the scene's drug crisis, dismantling heroin's glamour and prompting reflections among peers. Yet, her story is often treated as a footnote, overshadowed by the myths surrounding Cobain and love. This highlights why it's so important to remember her for who she truly was: a versatile musician, a dedicated activist, and a pillar of her community. Ultimately, Kristen Pfaff's story is one of immense, unfulfilled potential, a gifted artist and a passionate advocate whose bright future was cut short when she moved into the destructive world of mainstream rock. Her legacy urges remembrance of her vibrant contributions, musical passion, intellectual depth, and communal bonds over her end, highlighting fame's human toll in a myth-laden epic.